Today, I'm excited to interview the one and only Cyrus Khambatta, PhD. All right. Dr. Cyrus Khambatta is in the house. He's the co-founder of Mastering Diabetes with myself and the co-author of the upcoming book, Mastering Diabetes from Penguin Random House with myself as well. He earned a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from Stanford University in 2003. Then earned a PhD in nutritional biochemistry from the University of California at Berkeley in 2012. He is the co-author of many peer-reviewed scientific publications. He's been living with type 1 diabetes since 2002, and he co-created the Mastering Diabetes method to reverse insulin resistance in all forms of diabetes and has helped more than 3,000 people improve their metabolic health using low-fat, plant-based, whole food nutrition, intermittent fasting, and exercise. He's also a featured speaker at the Plant-Based Nutrition Healthcare Conference, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine Conference, PlantStock, the Torrance Memorial Medical Center, and has been featured on NPR, KQED, Forks Over Knives, Healthline, Fast Company, Diet Fiction, and the wildly popular podcasts Plant Proved and Nutrition Rounds, and the wildly popular podcast called the Mastering Diabetes Audio Experience. Cyrus, it's great to have you here with us today.
Awesome. Thanks for the intro, Robbie. I totally appreciate it.
Okay, so you have a interesting story being diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. So why don't you tell our viewers your story and how you got interested in plant-based nutrition and why diabetes is the best thing that ever happened to you. That's episode 50 of the Mastering Diabetes Audio Experience, but they're going to get to hear a summary right here today.
Yeah, thanks. So thanks for asking that. It's funny when I tell people that diabetes is the best thing that ever happened to me. A lot of people just kind of look at me like I have four eyes, and they don't understand why I would make such a statement as if I'm making something up. But the reality is that when I was first diagnosed with diabetes, life was very hard. It was very challenging. I did not like having diabetes, and it was not something that I would consider to be, one of the best things that ever happened to me. Over the course of time, as I learned more, as I became more regimented, as I became better at controlling my blood glucose, as I started to feel better, as my health improved, it became something that was very fun and something that was very, that I consider to be a gift. And the gift has also enabled me to help other people understand how they can also transform their health using plant-based nutrition. So if we go backwards in time, I was diagnosed at the age of 22 with type 1 diabetes, which is late because most people diagnosed with type 1 diabetes usually get at the age of 3, 5, 8, 13, somewhere in there sort of, as an infant or in adolescence. But I was diagnosed at the age of 22 when I was a senior in college at Stanford University. So I was just trying to graduate, move on with my life. And all of a sudden, I was extremely thirsty, urinating frequently, had no energy. And so I checked myself into the health center. I called my sister, who's a family practice doctor of osteopathy. I said, hey, here's my symptoms. She started crying immediately. She said, go to the health center. You have type 1 diabetes. And I looked at her and I was like, I don't have diabetes. Are you kidding me? There's no way I have diabetes. I was like, look at me. I'm normal weight. I'm not old. At that time, I literally thought that diabetes had something to do with old people and cake. That was all that I knew about diabetes. And here I was, young, athletic. It didn't make any sense. So I go to the hospital. They check me in. They give me an IV of glucose. They give me an IV of saline into one arm. Then they give me an IV of insulin into the other arm. And start monitoring my blood glucose over the course of 24 hours. And find that my insulin-producing beta cells in my pancreas had burned out over the course of time. And as a result of that, my blood glucose was now alarmingly high. Normal blood glucose between 70 and 130. My glucose, 600 plus. And the doctors were very alarmed by that. In addition to that, they also found out that I had two other autoimmune conditions. The first one is called Hashimoto's hypothyroidism. So it's an autoimmune version of hypothyroidism. The second one is called alopecia universalis, which is why I have no hair, no eyebrows, no eyelashes, nothing. The third one was type 1 diabetes. So I got all three of those over the course of the first of 6 months. So I went from being, a non-diseased, healthy individual to 1, 2, 3 autoimmune conditions within 6 months. And I was scared because I didn't understand what was happening under the surface. I didn't know anything about biology. I couldn't talk molecular and cell biology. I was studying engineering, and I just wanted to, move on with my life. So over the first year, I listened to the advice of the doctors at the time, which basically was to eat a low carbohydrate diet, because that's the advice they give to most people living with diabetes. At least it was then. And that's the advice that most people living with diabetes still receive today. So I did the low carbohydrate thing for about a year. And it was supposed to make my blood glucose more controllable, but it did the exact opposite. My blood glucose was a nightmare. It was up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down all day long. I mean, I'm talking no joke. On any given day, I would get 4 or 5 high blood glucose values in excess of 200, and I would get 4 or 5 hypoglycemic episodes less than 70. And when you are living on the blood glucose roller coaster, it takes a lot of mental and physical energy out of you. And so it felt like every single day I was just like chasing this roller coaster, trying to control it. And it was just it was just decreasing my quality of life. So after about a year of living this way, not only was my blood glucose uncontrollable, my insulin use was starting to creep up, started in the 20s, 30s. Then before I knew it was in the 40s, mid 40s. It was sometimes as high as 50 units per day, even though my carbohydrate intake wasn't changing. Exercise became hard. My muscles hurt. I couldn't exercise as much as I wanted to. And for me, that was the kicker. I love to exercise. I love to move my body. And the minute that you compromise my ability to move my body, you have some serious problems. So I started eating a diet that was a low-fat, plant-based whole food diet under the guidance of Douglas Graham, Dr. Doug Graham, who went on to write a book called the 80-10-10 book. He predominantly teaches people how to adopt a fruitarian diet. And at the time, he was the only person I knew that had any confidence in talking to me living with type 1 diabetes, because most other nutrition pros say, oh, you have type 1? No. I don't touch type 1. I don't understand type 1. Like, you got to go somewhere else. So Doug Graham took me under his wing and he said, listen, I'm going to show you a really powerful method for eating a low-fat, plant-based whole food diet. And I think you're going to be really pleasantly surprised by what you see. And I said, you know what? Let's do it. I have an open mind. Let's try it out. So under his guidance, I started to eat more plant-based foods. I eliminated all animal foods in one night because I said, you know what? I don't think that they're actually helping me out. And I'm just listening right now and I'm doing experiments. So let's try it out. So I eliminated all animal foods, whether they're meat, chicken, fish, dairy, eggs, bacon, you name it. And I went straight over to fruits and vegetables. And within the first 24 hours, my blood glucose fell, and it fell so quickly that I went hypoglycemic multiple times within the first 24 hours. So I had to cut back my insulin use. And then the next day it happened again. And then it happened again. And then it happened again. And then it happened again. Over the course of the first week, under his control, I had cut my insulin use by almost 40% in 7 days. But the beauty here was that not only was I using 40% less insulin, my carbohydrate intake had not increased a little bit. It didn't double. It didn't triple. It didn't quadruple. It five-tupled. And my insulin use was 40% less. In other words, I was eating 5 times as much carbohydrate energy using 40% less insulin. And I felt better. I had more energy. I was more hydrated. And I knew that something fascinating was happening under the surface. So I went back to my normal life, continued to live the lifestyle. My results got even better. Blood glucose control got even better. A1C fell, came into a very normal range. Cholesterol levels fell. And before I knew it, I was so fascinated by what was happening to me that I put myself back to graduate school. So I went and I got a PhD at UC Berkeley, studied there for 5 years, and was given the opportunity under the guidance of Dr. Mark Hellerstein, who's one of the world's experts in glucose metabolism and carbohydrate biology. He gave me the opportunity to study insulin resistance, the ins and outs. How do you create it? How do you reverse it? How does intermittent fasting affect it? How does exercise affect it? How does diet affect it? And while I was there, I learned a tremendous amount. The most important thing that I learned while I was in school was that the thing that had happened to me, the only person on the planet that I knew, was actually something that had happened to many people over the course of time. And the reason I knew that is because there is a tremendous amount of scientific literature that backs this up. So transitioning to a low-fat, plant-based whole food diet was something that I thought was just fascinating because this machine was changing in front of me. But in reality, the research led me to understand that this is something that has been documented over the course of almost 100 years and something that is truly very, very well studied from a rigorous scientific perspective and something that can absolutely change the lives of people living with any form of diabetes. Long story short, graduated, created Mastering Diabetes with you, and now here we are teaching people living with all forms of diabetes how to transition to a plant-based diet so that they can also achieve very similar results.
Cyrus, I've heard your story probably about 1,000,000 times by now, and it never gets old. And I still just want to remind you, even just how many people's lives you were affected even before we joined forces and starting Mastering Diabetes. And just the fact that you were an inspiration for me in the beginning. You were a testimonial in Doug Graham's book, which helped them, just got me on this path. And just want to acknowledge you for that, highlight that, and say that your perspective of how you handle 3 autoimmune diagnoses and live your life is incredibly inspiring. It impacts me. It impacts lots and lots of people. So just want to say that. Now, you did go right into our next question here, which is this idea of reversing insulin resistance. So if you can address the causes of insulin resistance, you can reverse it. So tell our viewers, what is insulin resistance and what causes it in the first place?
Okay. So insulin resistance is a pretty confusing topic, not because the biology is confusing, but because the interpretation of the biology has become overly complex in the world in which we live. So if you go into the scientific literature and actually look at what truly causes insulin resistance and what most strongly influences the development of insulin resistance, what you will find is something that I found very early in my research career, which was that I was given the task of inducing insulin resistance in laboratory animals. That was the experiment that we were trying to do. So we induce insulin resistance, and then you try and recover that insulin resistance using intermittent fasting and or calorie restriction. So I went into the literature and I started to read, well, how do you induce insulin resistance in laboratory animals? I don't know. The whole time I was thinking, you got to feed them some kind of sugar. You got to feed them fructose. You got to feed them sucrose. You got to feed them some kind of refined sweetener, because refined sweeteners cause insulin resistance and exacerbate diabetes. So I went in with that preconceived notion, then I started reading, and before I knew it, I started seeing the words lipid, fatty acid, saturated fatty acid, and these words kept on showing up over and over and over again. Before I knew it, I was like, wait a minute, what is happening here? It doesn't make any sense. And as I read more and more and more, I found out that in these experiments, when researchers have tried to induce insulin resistance in animals, the most effective way, the fastest, and the method that's used as a predominant method is to feed animals a diet that is extremely high in fat and that is especially high in saturated fat. And by doing so, they can induce this state known as insulin resistance, which primarily affects your muscle tissue and your liver tissue. So what ends up happening in this situation is that when you eat a diet that's high in saturated fat, when I say high in saturated fat, I mean something like 10 to 20% of total calories coming specifically from saturated fat, and more appropriately, a diet that contains approximately 60+% of calories of total fat. So regardless of whether that fat comes from animal sources or from plant sources, the idea is that when you're eating a diet that's predominantly based in high-fat foods, then your risk for the development of insulin resistance goes up dramatically. So in this situation, these fatty acids, they enter your mouth, they travel down your esophagus, they get all the way into your stomach, they're then passed into your small intestine. And inside of your small intestine, it's like a tube where these fatty acid molecules, they get separated from the food in which you ate them, and then they make their way through the walls of your small intestine to get into your lymph system. From your lymph system, they end up getting into your blood. Once they get into your blood, they're using your blood as a highway system to get to tissues all throughout your body. They want to get to your adipose tissue, your liver, your muscle, your kidneys, your pancreas, you name it. Any tissue that touches the blood can use fatty acids as fuel, with the exception of your brain. Your brain cannot do that. Now, these fatty acids are transported all throughout your body, and these fatty acids get uptaken into primarily 3 different tissues. The first one is your adipose tissue. So your adipose tissue is your fat tissue. Your fat tissue lives in many different locations. You find some in your neck, you find some in your armpits, you find some in the bottom of your triceps, in your abdomen, in your butt, in your legs. It's distributed all throughout your body. And your adipose tissue is actually a safe place to store fatty acids. So when those fatty acids come in from your diet, they go into your blood, they can make their way into adipose tissue because your adipose tissue is specifically designed to uptake those fatty acids, to store them, and then to release them when is necessary. But in addition to getting into your adipose tissue, these fatty acids also make their way to your liver and to your muscle. And that's when life can become problematic. The reason is because your liver and your muscle are specifically designed to uptake and store small amounts of fatty acids and small amounts of saturated fatty acids. That's how they're designed. So the liver and muscle are exposed to the blood. These fatty acids are in circulation. They march their way directly into tissues because these tissues don't really have a way to sort of defend themselves against the influx of these fatty acids. These fatty acids end up inside of your muscle. They end up inside of your liver. And over the course of time, as you consume higher and higher amounts of fat, or a high amount of fat over a long period of time, then your muscle and liver end up becoming slightly overwhelmed with too much fatty acid. So these fatty acids accumulate, they congregate into a thing called a lipid droplet, and this lipid droplet gets larger and larger and larger inside of cells in your liver and inside of cells in your muscle. Now, the reason this is important in the world of diabetes is because the next time you try and eat something that's carbohydrate rich, whether it's a banana, whether it's a mango, whether it's a bowl of quinoa, some raisins, it could be black beans, anything that contains carbohydrate energy. The carbohydrate energy enters your mouth, travels down your esophagus, gets into your stomach, gets into your small intestine. From your small intestine then starts to break apart these carbohydrate chains into glucose molecules. Glucose is absorbed, it's put into your blood. The glucose is then in circulation now. This is the second fuel that's now trying to find a home inside of your brain, inside of your liver, inside of your adipose tissue, your muscle, you name it. So these glucose molecules, unlike fatty acids, they have to be accompanied by an escort. And the escort is called insulin. So a small amount of glucose is able to just passively diffuse into tissues, a very small amount, without the use of insulin. But the majority of glucose in your blood requires insulin in order to get into tissues. So insulin comes and it knocks on the door of a tissue and says, hey, liver, there's glucose in the blood. Would you like to take up that glucose right now? And the cells in the liver can respond by either saying, sure, and they open the door and they allow the glucose to come in, or they say, no, I'm not going to let this stuff in, and they leave the glucose outside. Now, in a situation where you've already consumed a high-fat diet for some period of time, and these saturated fatty acid molecules have accumulated inside of liver cells and inside of muscle cells, the next time you eat a carbohydrate-rich food, the glucose molecules come to the door, insulin knocks, hey, I got this glucose molecules, do you want to take it up? And the tissues respond by saying, I can't. I don't have the opportunity to do it right now. The reason is because I have all this fatty acid material inside of me first. This lipid droplet has grown to be too large. I got to oxidize this stuff first. So let me get rid of this stuff first, and then you can come back. So as a result of that, insulin resistance occurs, okay? The tissue has become resistant to communicating with insulin. Another way to think about it is that the tissue is rejecting insulin. So insulin is actually attempting, it's knocking on the door saying, hey, I got this glucose. And the tissue responds by saying, I'm not going to take up that glucose. Not going to work. So the insulin gets rejected, the tissue becomes insulin resistant, and as a result of that, glucose has no exit strategy. It's sitting in your blood. It begins to pool over the course of time. And 2 hours later, after eating that bowl of quinoa, you then check your blood glucose meter, you look at the number, and you're like, what? My glucose is a 284? That's weird. I didn't even have that much. I just had, a half a cup of quinoa, and boom, now my glucose is up. I had one banana, for heaven's sakes, and my glucose is way up. I guess carbohydrate-rich food is bad for me. I guess I can't eat carbohydrates. And thus begins the anti-carbohydrate philosophy, and thus begins this idea that carbohydrates are the problem and the cause. So if you had the opportunity to sort of reverse engineer this whole system to try and get those glucose molecules into the tissues, the answer is don't try and fight the symptomology. Just go backwards in time and try to find out what caused the plug. The plug was caused by not saturated fat, but excess saturated fat. It's the excess accumulation of saturated fat inside of muscle and liver that then overwhelms cells in those tissues to being able to respond and communicate with insulin. And as a result of that, the glucose got trapped. So all you have to do is go backwards in time and say, all right, let me reduce the total fat content of my diet, reduce the saturated fat content of my diet. And by doing so, I can preserve the insulin sensitivity of my liver and muscle cells. And as a result of that, the next time I eat carbohydrate-rich anything, those glucose molecules can enter, your blood glucose stays nice and low, very well controlled, and now you're in an insulin-sensitive state, which makes your life much easier. Does that make sense?
This is very clear. It makes perfect sense. But now I want to talk about this concept of, you openly talk about this conversation, which you just went over, about carbohydrate, fat, and protein being oversimplified, but still important. So what's the problem with talking about carbohydrate, fat, and protein?
Yeah, I'm actually glad you asked this question because, as we're talking about carbohydrate, fat, protein, saturated fat, sometimes I'm listening to myself thinking, don't use those words. Those are not the right words to be using. And the truth is that people don't eat fat and protein and carbohydrate. People eat food. You eat food. I eat food. And the food is a three-dimensional complex matrix that contains fat, carbohydrate, protein, vitamins, minerals, fiber, water, antioxidants, phytochemicals, and a whole collection of material that scientists are still identifying now over the course of time. And so simplifying, a hot dog to saying that's fat is just an oversimplified approach. It's not scientifically accurate. So that being said, we talk about food. You eat food, you eat carbohydrate-rich foods, you don't eat carbs. You eat fat-rich foods, you don't eat fat. But from a cellular mechanistic perspective, it's important to understand the effect that carbohydrate, fat, and protein have on the transport of glucose, on insulin sensitivity. And once you understand that, then you can take one step backwards and say, okay, fine, now I understand the mechanisms. Now let's talk about food. Okay, so we have to kind of dig into the mechanisms, understand the nitty-gritty details of what's happening inside of this weird world we call molecular cellular biology, and then take a step backwards and say, okay, great. Well, what's the solution? What is the food I should put on my plate in order to solve these problems and make my glucose more controllable?
And this is one of the things that you are so good at, is you are so good at taking complex scientific concepts, what's going on, what you've studied in the research and all the publications you've worked on in the laboratory, and then take it out and be like, wait a minute, how can we understand that? And what do we do? What do we actually do in order to address these problems to get the better health that we're looking for? So you're a genius at that.
I appreciate that, man. Thank you so much.
So most people think that insulin resistance only affects people living with prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, but you say that it affects everyone living with all forms of diabetes. So why is that the case?
Okay. Before we get there, let me just say one more thing about this conversation about fat and protein and carbohydrate, because there's some subtle nuanced differences about various types of fatty acids that can also add a little bit more complexity and a little bit more scientific accuracy to this conversation. And, we, just like Robbie said at the beginning, we wrote a book, and the book has, an unbelievable amount of information about all of these nitty-gritty details. And so one of the things that we cover in the book here is that when it comes to fatty acids, there's basically three types of fatty acids. There's trans fatty acids, there's saturated fatty acids, and there's unsaturated fatty acids. And all three of these are not equal to each other. They have very specific biological functions, and they are not equal to each other in the sense that they influence the development of insulin resistance and diabetes differently, very differently than each other. So the first type is trans fatty acids. And these trans fatty acids are, they're found in very small quantities in foods like beef and pork and lamb and butter and milk, just naturally occurring. But the overwhelming majority of the trans fatty acids that your standard American or, anybody eating a Western diet actually eats doesn't come from those foods. It actually comes from the hydrogenation process. Hydrogenation process is a way that you take a liquid a liquid fat at room temperature and convert it into a solid fat so that you can literally spread it and it becomes more, it has a longer shelf life and it becomes more palatable for consumers. So you'll find hydrogenated vegetable oils, and you'll find these in the grocery store, and they're all over the place in things like cakes, pies, cookies, biscuits, breakfast sandwiches, margarine, crackers, microwave popcorn, you name it. It's all over the place. And so these trans fatty acids have been shown in a number of different research papers to be very problematic for metabolic health, including cardiovascular conditions like congestive heart disease, stroke, atherosclerosis, high cholesterol, and high blood pressure. Studies show that the more trans fatty acids you consume, the higher your risk is for the development of many of these cardiovascular conditions. They can also elevate your LDL cholesterol. They can reduce your HDL cholesterol. So they're elevating the bad cholesterol, reducing the good cholesterol, and they can cause vascular inflammation. And all of those are conditions that nobody wants. Okay. Now, when it comes to saturated fatty acids are sort of the most. Trans fatty acids are the worst in sort of harming your metabolic health and inducing insulin resistance. Saturated fatty acids are the second worst, but they're the most abundant. So trans fatty acids are there for sure in all those products that I mentioned, but saturated fatty acids are found all over the place, both in plant and animal foods. They're found mainly in meat, poultry, fish, shellfish, and dairy products like butter, cheese, milk, yogurt, and sour cream. Okay, but they're also found in plant foods, including vegetable oils, including coconut oil, including palm oil, cocoa butter. There's some in avocados. There's some in coconuts. There's some in nuts, and there's some in seeds. So these saturated fatty acids are the fatty acids that I talked about earlier, the ones that actually get inside of your liver and muscle, and they overwhelm your liver and muscle into being able to communicate effectively with insulin. And they thus sort of interfere, like direct interference with the insulin signaling pathway. And when that happens, then your blood glucose becomes much more challenging to manage. Now, there's a number of very, very in-depth effects about how saturated fatty acids specifically interact with your liver and your muscle and your pancreas. We're not going to get into too much detail about that, but just understand that the more saturated fat you eat, the higher your risk for the development of insulin resistance, which then exacerbates your blood glucose control. Okay. Now, the final one is unsaturated fatty acids, and unsaturated fatty acids are the least problematic form of fatty acids. And the reason for this is because these unsaturated fatty acids are actually put into the membranes of cells, and they're put into cell membranes all throughout your body in every single tissue. So they're absolutely required. They're known as MUFAs and PUFAs, okay, otherwise known as monounsaturated fatty acids and polyunsaturated fatty acids. And the idea here is that these two types of fatty acids, they're not used as fuel, but instead they're actually put into the membrane, and it controls fluidity and nutrient transport across cell membranes. There's actually some studies, some very elegant studies that were published in the British Medical Journal. There's a collection of 395 metabolic ward studies that found something very simple, which is that replacing 10%, just 10% of your calories from saturated fat with an equal amount of polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fat can reduce your cholesterol by approximately 25 milligrams per deciliter. Okay, so we're talking a small change from saturated to unsaturated can dramatically reduce your LDL cholesterol, and that's a big deal. So in reality, what we're talking about here is making a dietary transition that's going to, in which you're going to eat real food, and by eating very specific types of foods and omitting or reducing certain types of foods, you can naturally gravitate towards less total fat, less saturated fat, less trans fat, and less mono and polyunsaturated fats. And as a result of that, your insulin sensitivity continues to increase.
I'm glad you brought that up, because there is a lot of confusion when it comes to the sources of fat. Everybody's talking about good fats and bad fat. And so you just clarified a lot of that. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about this. I'm on the edge of my seat for this next one, Cyrus. This whole conversation about people living with insulin resistance and this concept affecting all forms of diabetes.
For sure. Okay. This is one of my favorite subjects to talk about. So Traditionally speaking, insulin resistance is only really talked about in the context of prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. If you look online, if you go talk to any endocrinologist, if you talk to any internal medicine doctor and you bring up the word insulin resistance, the first thing that'll pop into their head is prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. And the reason for that is simple. Insulin resistance causes prediabetes. Prediabetes turns into type 2 diabetes over the course of time. So it's a linear progression. You start with insulin resistance, you become pre-diabetic becomes type 2, and it has to go in that sequence. At all points along this process, it is actually possible to move backwards towards less insulin resistance and more insulin sensitivity. And by doing that, you can actually decrease your risk and actually prevent prediabetes and type 2 diabetes from even starting in the first place. Okay? So we've known this, scientists have known this for over 100 years, that insulin resistance is a required prerequisite in order to develop prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. And that's very well accepted. But what scientists also have discovered over time, which the medical community is now playing catch up to, and the general population is now playing catch up to, is the fact that insulin resistance is also present in many, many, many other situations. Number one, it is present in non-diabetic individuals. Insulin resistance is present in non-diabetic individuals and a very high number of non-diabetic individuals. And we know this to be true because there are studies that actually show that insulin resistance is detectable 5 to 10 years before prediabetes becomes detectable. So like I said earlier, insulin resistance is a required prerequisite to become pre-diabetic. The question is, do you develop insulin resistance today and prediabetes tomorrow? The answer is no. It takes years to develop. And so if you can measure and actually detect insulin resistance now in your blood using very specific tests, then you can prevent the development of prediabetes and type 2 diabetes altogether. So it's very important to understand that, because a lot of people listen to this conversation about insulin resistance, and the first thing they do is they go, oh, well, I don't have diabetes. I'm fine. I don't have diabetes. I exercise. Come on. I'm a normal weight. I don't have diabetes. Like I don't need to worry about that. I can eat whatever I want, right? And the truth
My A1C is perfect. I have a good A1C. I got it tested.
Exactly right. My blood glucose is flat. My fasting blood glucose is a 94. I don't have diabetes. I don't need to worry about insulin resistance, okay? The answer is not true, okay? Secondarily, people living with autoimmune diabetes, you, me, people living with type 1.5 diabetes, which is adult onset, slow progressing autoimmune diabetes, okay? This is a very large population. There are some people who believe, some researchers who have postulated that type 1.5 diabetes is actually a larger number of people around the planet than type 1 diabetes. And that is that people, again, are developing autoimmune versions of diabetes later in life beyond the age of 30. So we'll pool all of this collection of people together, type 1 and type 1.5. We're talking potentially over, I'd say, 50 to 100 million people around the planet. And these people also are susceptible to experiencing insulin resistance. And the way that you do it is simply by adopting a low carbohydrate and or high fat diet. Okay, so how does this work? I said earlier, you can develop insulin resistance first, and then that can set into motion the dominoes leading towards prediabetes and type 2. So insulin resistance is the first domino, then comes prediabetes, then comes type 2 diabetes. In this situation, most people end up developing autoimmune diabetes through some type of environmental collection of problems, either resulting from a virus that comes from the environment or from specific antigens found in your food. But the idea is that you get type 1 diabetes occurs over the course of time, and then as soon as you switch over to a low carbohydrate diet, because again, you've been thinking for the longest time, oh, carbohydrates are bad for me, I'm not going to eat carbohydrates. So you start eating more fat-rich foods. You adopt a low carbohydrate diet, a paleo diet, or a ketogenic diet. As soon as you do that, then you actually induce insulin resistance from your mouth. So autoimmunity is first. Insulin resistance is second because of a diet that's high in fat and especially high in saturated fat. And then as a result of that, you end up with this condition called double diabetes. Double diabetes equals autoimmunity plus insulin resistance that occurs from your diet. And when you're living with autoimmunity plus insulin resistance, I will give you a giant good luck controlling your glucose. Good luck. It is very hard to do. It is extremely hard to do. That's what happened to me when I first adopted a low carbohydrate diet in the first year of living with type 1 diabetes. I was following this methodology and I thought it was going to make my blood glucose more controllable, but it became very hard to do. The only way that you can actually control your blood glucose when living with a high degree of insulin sensitivity as somebody with autoimmune diabetes is to dramatically reduce your total carbohydrate intake and to eat something like 30, 40 grams of carbohydrate per day maximum. If you eat anything more than that, your glucose will go all over the place and it'll make your life extremely challenging.
Okay, this is such an important conversation that you're bringing up here, and there's a lot of nuances there. And I want to go into it just a little bit more because I want you to talk a little bit about this concept of glucose intolerance, okay? Like, what is the relationship between insulin resistance and glucose intolerance, and what is happening in the people who are choosing to basically eat themselves into that state?
Yeah, okay, so this is a really good question, actually, because in the world of, there's a lot of low carbohydrate diet advocates that will tell you that glucose intolerance and insulin resistance are different things altogether, and that they're not one and the same, and that you can be glucose intolerant but insulin sensitive at the same time. And when I first heard this, I thought to myself, like, don't think that's right, but let me do a little bit of reading and a little bit of digging into the research. And what I came across is actually very, very important here, which is that it is not possible to be glucose intolerant and insulin sensitive at the same time. Now, the reason for that is very simple, actually. I want you to think of glucose metabolism as having basically two fundamental aspects to it. The first aspect of glucose metabolism is what happens to glucose and insulin in the fasting state. Okay? When you have fasted for something like 12 to 16 to 18 hours, what is your glucose and insulin doing? That's called fasting glucose metabolism. Then the second aspect of glucose metabolism is called postprandial or post-meal glucose metabolism. So that is, what is glucose and insulin doing after you eat a meal? Okay. And in order to understand how insulin resistance and insulin sensitivity is affecting you, you cannot measure only one of those. You have to measure both of them and take both of them into account. Otherwise, you're missing the bigger picture. So in the world of low carbohydrate diets, what you will find all over the place is that people get exceptionally good fasting insulin sensitivity. And the reason we know that is because you eat a low carbohydrate diet and your glucose levels fall. So you wake up in the morning with a very good fasting glucose, and your insulin levels fall. So you have low fasting insulin, low fasting glucose, and you think to yourself, well, hey, that's a good thing. So that means that you're actually insulin sensitive in the fasting state. The problem is that the minute that a low carbohydrate dieter attempts to eat carbohydrate rich food, then most of the time in the postprandial state, 1 to 2 hours after a meal, their blood glucose will be extremely high and their insulin requirements will also be extremely high. So in the fasting state, they are quote unquote insulin sensitive, but in the postprandial state, they're actually insulin resistant. And so this idea that glucose tolerance and insulin resistance are actually different is just it's just a semantic argument. It's just sort of like, let me call it one thing, but not another thing. And it's only applicable here, but not applicable there. But the idea is actually very simple. If you're glucose intolerant, you're glucose intolerant, period, end of story. Glucose intolerant and insulin resistance are one and the same. Now, in a low carbohydrate setting, like I said, fasting glucose and insulin are down, but postprandial glucose and insulin are up. And as a result of that, now you're in a situation where the only way to keep your postprandial blood glucose and insulin down is to do what? It's to reduce your carbohydrate intake. That's the only way to keep it down. So that's why low carbohydrate dieters eat a low carbohydrate diet, because they know without question that the minute they eat carbohydrate rich foods, their glucose and insulin requirements go up. And so they say to themselves, well, that doesn't work. Let me keep it down. And now fasting and postprandial are both good, but it has to be very low carbohydrate in order to get that effect.
Okay, we could talk about this forever. Thank you for clearing that up. This has been absolutely fantastic. I got one more question for you.
Yeah.
What's the number one challenge you see people facing when they start to make lifestyle change? When they start to begin adopting the Mastering Diabetes method, they have all the information, they've read the book, they're starting to do it. What's the challenge that you see them come across, and how do you help them overcome it?
Okay, the number one challenge that I do see that people experience when they adopt a low fat plant-based whole food diet is consistency. I tell people this all the time. I say, I don't care how hard you exercise. I don't care how out of breath you become. I don't care how many hours of intermittent fasting you did or how good that breakfast was that you ate. I care, but I don't really care. What I care about is how consistent you are in your movement patterns, in your eating habits, in your ability to maintain a low stress lifestyle, and in your ability to integrate intermittent fasting when necessary. If you become consistent in all four of those aspects of your life, then your blood glucose control will become very, very predictable. What I see a lot of people doing is they come into the Mastering Diabetes method, or they make some type of dietary change, even if they're adopting a paleo diet as an example, or a ketogenic diet. And they'll do it for like Monday, and then kind of Tuesday, and then maybe Wednesday. Then they'll go out to dinner with a friend and drink a bunch of alcohol on Thursday, and then they'll have a cheat day on Friday, and then they'll start over on Saturday, and then they'll recommit, and then it'll last for like 5 days, and then they'll go out to dinner again, and then it's just this roller coaster. And they're expecting to get good results, but their habits have not been they haven't worked on their habits enough to be able to turn themselves into a robot that is literally doing things in a very systematic, predictable manner in order to get systematic and predictable results. And so I encourage people to work on their habits, and we try and teach people to change their habits in a step-by-step manner and not think of this as a race. One step at a time, take one tiny aspect of your life and work on it for 7 days in a row. And then once you've incorporated that, then move on to the next habit, then move on to the next habit. But if you don't have those habits in place, then making lifestyle changes, it becomes really hard, extremely hard.
You know, Cyrus, one of the things I love about you, one of the million things, is that you live the consistency model. Like, you put it into action. I've seen you traveling at conferences, we're doing interviews, we're traveling around, and you are making sure that CrossFit class is booked. There's nothing getting around that. You know, we source the food, like, you make it happen. So thank you for being you. Thank you for doing what you're doing. I mean, it is just truly an honor and a privilege and just a lot of fun to be working with you on all these Mastering Diabetes projects, and the book writing process was such a pleasure. I mean, I learn from you every day. I'm continuing to learn more. Your genius, that nutritional biochemistry background, is just proven to be so important and so valuable in helping people make lifestyle change. So thank you for putting in all the time and the effort in your education process, and today to continue reading the research, digging into the new information that's coming out, and helping people truly understand what is going on, making it clear. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for saying that, man. I really appreciate you saying all that. You know, it's been one heck of a journey to be able to create Mastering Diabetes and truly change people's lives with your help. And, you know, you've been a huge inspiration to me along the way in many aspects. I mean, your food buying ability and your ability to like help me become consistent in my own habits is just like exceptional. The amount of documentation that you do, the amount of blood glucose monitoring, and like not perfection, but the amount of attention and care that you put into making sure your blood glucose is nice and stable is something that I've learned tremendous amounts from. And, you know, I totally appreciate all the effort that you put into this as well. I have one question for you. on behind your right ear, there is something that looks like 100-year-old papaya. What is that thing?
This is cacao fruit. So you split it in half, and then on the inside, there are these seeds, and you suck the seeds. You suck the white part off the seed. That's the fruit. And then people use the seed to actually make chocolate.
Oh, wow. Okay. I literally was like, wow, he should probably put that papaya in the trash.
If you haven't noticed, guys, Cyrus is also a true, like a professional comedian. If only you could be in our meetings and see him playing with his cats. This whole thing is just so much fun. So thank you, Cyrus, for today's amazing interview and everything you do. And I'll catch you on the flip side.
You got a deal. Thanks, buddy.